In this lecture, we are going to work with radio buttons. To start, I run Android Studio. I click Start a new Android Studio project to create a new project. I name my project Radio Buttons, and the project is stored in the Material Design Projects folder. Next, I set the minimum decay to API 15 and next, empty activity and next, and finish. I wait until Android Studio creates my project. Alright, the Gradle operations finished successfully and my project was created. I go to the resource folder and inside the layout folder, I open the activity main layout. Now I go to the text section and I remove constraint layout completely. Then I define a relative layout instead. In the previous section, I set the height and width of the relative layout equal to match parent. The next thing I'm going to do is to define an AppCompatRadioButton inside my relative layout. AppCompatRadioButtons are good substitutes for normal radio buttons. One of their advantages is that they preserve their material characteristics in Androids below Lollipop. I type android.support.v7.widget.appCompatRadioButton. My AppCompatRadioButton requires a height and a width. In the previous section, I set its height and width to wrapped content. You see that my radio button was created under the toolbar. Now I'm going to define an ID for it. @+ID / radio button 1 _ ID. After ID, I define a text for it. For example, radio button 1. I press Alt and return, extract string resource, and OK. After text, I define a margin, and I give it a value of 16 dp. Now let's run the project on the emulator. Alright, our application is successfully running on the emulator. As you can see, we have a radio button on the activity. Radio buttons only have an on state. So when we click the radio button, it's selected, and if we click it again, it doesn't change. So radio buttons only have one state, unlike checkboxes. When we select the radio button, its color changes to color accent. You can change the color code for color accent or define a new style for your radio button and change the value of color accent inside the style. Okay, I stop my emulator and I go to the values folder. Now I open colors.xml. I create a new color. I name it color radio button and I close the color. For its value, I go to material colors to select a color from the list. For example, I select green. I copy the code for A200 and return to Android Studio. Then I paste it inside color radio button. I close colors.xml and I open styles.xml. Then I create a new style for my radio button. Similar to switches and checkboxes, I name my style radio button theme and I close the style. Inside the style, I'm going to define an item, Android : color accent. Then I close my item. For its value, I type the name of the color that I defined in colors.xml, @color/color radio button. You see that Android Studio shows an error for the color accent item. So as before, I remove the Android : part from my item. So we created a new style, and inside the style, we changed the value of color accent. Now I return to my activity main layout, and I type the name of the style that I created for my AppCompatRadioButton. I type app : I import app to my layout by pressing Alt and Return. Theme equals @style/radio button theme. Now let's take a look at our project in action. Alright, the application was launched on the emulator successfully. I activate my radio button. You see that as the radio button is selected, its color is changed to green, and it doesn't follow color accent anymore. You can set any color that you want for your radio button. I stop my emulator. As in switches, we can set the default state of our radio button to selected. I type Android:checked. If I set the value of this attribute to true, the radio button will be already selected by default on app startup. Okay, let's run the project. Alright, our application was launched successfully on the emulator. As you can see, the radio button is selected by default. That's because we have set the default value of the checked attribute to true. Now I change this attribute to false. Okay, that's it for our AppCompatRadioButton. For now, I'm done with the activity main layout. I close it and I open the main activity class. Now I want to talk about the AppCompatRadioButton methods. Inside the main activity, I define an object from the AppCompatRadioButton class. I name my object radio button and semicolon. Inside the onCreate method, I get the reference for my object. Radio button equals, I cast the right part to AppCompatRadioButton, find view by ID, and I pass it r.id.radiobutton1_id. And semicolon. Now I use a method from the AppCompatRadioButton class. I type radiobutton dot set unchecked change listener. Inside the parentheses, I type new unchecked change listener. You see that the unchecked change method was added to our class. When we select our radio button, this method is called. Also, we have a boolean parameter named b for this method. So I type system.out.println and I pass it the b parameter. This will print out the value of the b boolean parameter. Now let's run the project on the emulator. Once the application is running on the emulator, I select my radio button. As you see, the word true was printed out in the Android monitor window. This shows that the unchecked change method was executed and our radio button is in the selected state. Now if I click the radio button again, you see that the code inside the unchecked change method is not executed anymore. And that's because the status of our radio button hasn't changed. Okay, that's it for this lecture. Make sure you watch the rest of radio button tutorials in the next lecture.